Hello and welcome to the Cryptocurrency News Channel. Bitcoin is up above 41,000 again, so strong today. However, we might actually have some trouble in the future because the dollar index, the DXY, is actually very, very strong as well. In fact, if you look at the DYX chart, according to the 6 months, it's actually grown from about 93.56 to about 100.95. So it's actually been extremely strong and it looks like it's continuing to rise. If you look at the yearly, we've gone from 90 to about 100. And the reason that dollar index is rising is because of like rising inflation elsewhere in the world. And you might think that's good for Bitcoin, but realistically, like Bitcoin competes against the dollar more than anything else because the dollar is the mostly the reserve currency of the world. It's not the only reserve currency. The SDR actually composes of like 60% dollar, 20% euro, some Japanese yen, some Chinese yuan, but the dollar is the dominant one, and it's actually growing much, much stronger against other currencies. Now, a lot of that is because of the war in Europe. The ruble has basically like committed seppuku, and essentially the other currencies aren't doing as well either. So the dollar is very strong against them. Now, this might be a little bit weird because even the dollar is actually inflating, as many Americans know, and that could potentially be good for Bitcoin in the longer term because Bitcoin has a fixed supply and the dollar doesn't. But generally, the dollar and BTC has a negative correlation. And as to why the dollar index is actually increasing or dollars getting stronger, first is an increase in global inflation stemming from another commodity supply shock. Second is a race for safe haven assets situated outside of Europe, namely US dollars. Now, the safe haven assets, you guys are saying, wow, why isn't that Bitcoin? Because the thing is, like, Bitcoin might actually be a more safe haven asset in Belarus or Russia, but that's only really because they can't get their hands on dollars. See, Bitcoin is definitely seen more as an investment asset in the US or in most of Europe. So it's still a risk on asset, which is the opposite of a safe haven asset. And generally, risk on assets behave the exact opposite of safe haven assets. So that's very, very different. And the dollar index obviously is crawling to maybe like a 2-3 year high. If you look at the 3 year, the last time we actually had a dollar index that was like this high was basically only like March of 2020, and that's actually when we had that catastrophic kind of like that kind of like catastrophic dump or the flash crash. Now, I don't think we're going to have another flash crash, obviously, unless like Putin starts using nukes or something. But as you can see, as the dollar index went down into 2021, and the dollar index actually reached a low in 2021, Bitcoin actually reached an all-time high, and now it's basically almost at a 3 year high, which means Bitcoin could possibly go to like Bitcoin could possibly actually go to a much lower basically a much lower pace. And if you actually look at the all graph, you can see the dollar index was actually really high back in the 80s, once again very high back in the 90s, early 2000s, and that's like the dot-com boom crash. And the dollar index tends to be actually like fairly high when the U.S. economy isn't doing very well, and that has to do with like our trade relations. And the dollar index does actually kind of like tend to indicate that there's inflation elsewhere in the world. So it's not as high as it was back in the late 80s or early 2000s, but it is much higher than basically we've been for the last 10 or so years. Only basically back 2015 through 2019 was it actually really high, and now we're actually going back there. But like Bitcoin's only survived for about 10 years, and in the last couple of years, in 2019, 2020, 2021, Bitcoin has basically performed better when the dollar index is actually low. As you can see, back in 2017, 2018, which was the last bull run before this one, the dollar index was also pretty low at 92, 93. Now it hasn't really been it wasn't as low as 2011 when it was 70 something, or 2008 when it was 70 something. But the thing is, like, in 2008, Bitcoin didn't exist. In 2011, Bitcoin did perform very well, but it was like very, very new. It was only maybe like a couple of bucks, so it doesn't really count. So generally, if you take a look from like 2013 onwards, the areas when Bitcoin actually performed the best were actually in 2017, late 2017 into early 2018, when the DXY took a little dip here, and of course, again, in 2020, 2021, when the DXY took a little dip here. Now, these are small dips. I think, imagine if we had this giant dip like we did back in 2011 when the dollar index fell to 70. I think that would actually go for a very, very big come up. But right now, the dollar index is kind of high. And I think like the dollar index might actually keep rising as long as the war in Russia goes on, because that will actually devalue other currencies against the dollar. And as the dollar index gets stronger, Bitcoin might actually remain a little weaker for an extended amount of time. So if you are basing your investments based on the dollar index the last few years, because Bitcoin is fairly negative correlated with the dollar index, at least since like 2016 or so. And before that, like Bitcoin was honestly really too small to take into consideration. We might be looking at a weak market for at least a couple of months yet, as the war drags on and as like the euro and other currencies actually slag against the dollar. So that's the news for today. Let me know what you think. Like and subscribe, hit that bell notifications button, and I will see you guys later.